There are numerous theories and opinions, both official and unofficial, about who might have been the creators of polygonal structures. This is hardly surprising. The question of authorship can hardly be considered thoroughly studied. Overall, these theories can be divided into two large groups. The first group adheres to the thesis. The Inca were skilled stonemasons, and therefore they were the creators. This is the officially recognized version. The second group holds the opposite view. Polygonal structures were not built by the Inca. Within this group, there are several subvariants. For example, the Inca were merely talented organizers, while the technical aspects were handled by master craftsmen brought in from elsewhere. Or another version. The Inca had nothing to do with it. Polygonal structures were created before they occupied this territory. Perhaps even long before that. Both of these versions are also considered official, though they are not as widely accepted. At the same time, the latter theory has several subcategories, which mainly differ in their estimation of the time gap between the Inca and those who actually engaged in polygonal construction. Separate from the official theories is another large group of versions. Among them, there are both rational and rather exotic ideas. However, they all essentially express the same notion. Polygonal structures were built by an unknown civilization that was technologically advanced. The proposed authors range from highly developed ancient local civilizations to various extraterrestrial visitors arriving in spacecraft. Sorting through these theories and determining which one best aligns with reality is no simple task. Each presents its own arguments in favor of its claims. Therefore, it is worth examining the most significant aspects related to this issue. Perhaps this will bring us a little closer to the answer. The view of the Inca as master stonemasons and experienced polygonal builders is considered scientifically justified and well argued. The main argument is the presence of polygonal structures found in the vicinity of Inca buildings made of roughly worked small stones. Additionally, some buildings and facings contain isolated fragments of polygonal masonry. At the same time, the mixing of different construction techniques and their layering within Inca structures is regarded as the norm. It is believed that the Inca used polygonal masonry selectively, where it was necessary to highlight a particular structure among others, or to emphasize an important part of a structure with well-finished and carefully fitted blocks. This perspective has been repeated in academic works for over half a century, virtually unchanged. Another strong argument is the results of experiments on stone processing using simple stone tools such as hammers and chisels. Proponents of the idea that polygonal blocks were produced with such tools have repeatedly described and demonstrated how the desired results could have been achieved. One of them, Jean-Pierre Protzen, dedicated considerable effort and time to answering questions related to the quarrying, transportation, and processing of polygonal blocks. It is particularly important that he himself comments on the results of his research as follows. Replicative experiments are the best way to test whether a particular technique works, how it works, and what its consequences are. However, a successful experiment does not necessarily mean that this method was actually used. At best, it is a demonstration of feasibility. Other methods could have produced the same result. It is worth noting, however, that such experiments address only certain aspects of the creation of polygonal masonry. Primarily, the production of surfaces that roughly meet the requirement of a tight fit. Other details found on polygonal blocks, such as edges, recesses, ridges, and knobs, are not considered, as their function in block creation is generally ignored. At best, recesses and knobs are regarded as auxiliary elements that played a role in placing the blocks. In other words, despite all efforts, the question remains as unresolved as it was before the experiments. The key issue is still determining the actual method by which polygonal blocks and seamless masonry were created. There is practically nothing more to comment on here. As for cases where a polygonal structure appears among buildings made of poorly worked stone, such examples are indeed abundant. It is quite common, for instance, to see trapezoidal openings in structures built from unworked or partially worked stone, yet framed with polygonal blocks. However, in all such cases, the difference between sections built with different technologies is too pronounced. It clearly goes beyond the mere intent to accentuate a part of the structure with more advanced craftsmanship. Even visually, their combination cannot be called organic. This difference indicates not just a desire to achieve a different, more refined appearance, but rather fundamentally different abilities and capabilities of those who built these different sections. The Inca generally had no issue with building walls from compacted earth. They also used clay. Many of their structures were made from unworked small stones, some with mortar, others without. These types of buildings are the most numerous. However, skills in working with clay, unworked small stones, or mortar-based construction techniques are simply not suited for creating polygonal structures. Polygonal technology has nothing in common with such construction methods. Even when solving the same problem, for example, securing an element within masonry, they employ completely different approaches. One uses interlocking block connections. The other relies on mortar. Clearly, the knowledge, skills, and tools required for making mortar are irrelevant when constructing polygonal masonry. They simply have no application there. Likewise, the knowledge, skills, and tools appropriate for preparing seating surfaces in polygonal masonry are irrelevant for clay mortar construction. And this applies not just to seating surfaces. Polygonal technology required specialized skills in almost every aspect. This included everything related to sourcing suitable materials, considering construction volumes, and the fact that most polygonal complexes are monolithic in composition. Then, all aspects of quarrying. Next, transporting the raw blocks to the construction site, often across dozens of kilometers of mountainous terrain. Then, all aspects of processing the blocks, methods of working the stone, and the necessary tools. Then, the actual laying process, including moving the blocks around the site, lifting them into position, and fitting them precisely into place. And if a complex was planned, additional tasks were required: choosing and reinforcing the foundation, organizing drainage, and ensuring water supply. The result of all these efforts was a polygonal complex. As practice shows, such structures were capable of existing for long periods without maintenance. For example, Machu Picchu remained in a completely autonomous state for nearly 4 centuries without suffering significant damage. Its foundation was so stable that even the buildings made of unworked stone and mortar on its territory did not deteriorate much over that time. This was possible because the polygonal complex was originally designed as an entity organically integrated into its surroundings, essentially flesh and blood of the landscape itself. As we can see, this was by no means a simple task. Moreover, although block processing is listed as a separate stage, in reality, it was an ongoing process throughout all phases of preparation. It began at the quarry and concluded only when the exposed face of a fitted block attained its final, facade-ready appearance. The entire process of preparing and assembling polygonal masonry required specialized knowledge and the ability to work with andesite, granite, and limestone blocks and megaliths. It is absolutely clear that such expertise could not be gained through experience with clay, earth embankments, or rough stone masonry with mortar. For this reason, the Inca Maita system, a labor obligation in which communities provided workers for major public projects, does not provide an explanation. Neither 1,000 craftsmen accustomed to working with small unworked stone, nor tens of thousands of them, nor even the best organizational effort could solve this problem. Such workers could certainly create something impressive. Most likely, they were responsible for constructing the unworked stone buildings at Machu Picchu, Ollantaytambo, Paisac, and other sites. Likewise, they built agricultural terraces throughout the region, covering over 1 million hectares. The scale of these efforts is undeniably impressive, involving millions of cubic meters of relocated soil and stones, an excellent demonstration of the capabilities of this civilization. But all of these structures were built from materials they were familiar with and knew how to handle. Moreover, construction with such materials allows thousands of workers to operate simultaneously. Walls can be built from multiple starting points at once. Each person has a role: carrying and supplying stone, mixing and delivering mortar. Polygonal masonry construction, however, has entirely different characteristics. It follows a strict sequence of operations. This type of masonry is assembled block by block, with each seating surface being unique and only achievable after the placement of the preceding blocks that define it. This sequence dictates a strict rhythm for the process. Equally importantly, it limits the scale of simultaneous work. As a result, the idea that thousands of workers were needed becomes irrelevant. A dozen skilled masons working in 2 or 3 directions, supported by 2 or 3 dozen apprentices, that's all. For anyone else on the construction site, there would simply be nothing to do. There was also no need for thousands of workers to deliver raw blocks, since transportation had to align with the work rhythm. Another important point to consider when analyzing structures that contain both polygonal blocks and unworked small stone sections is their architectural and aesthetic relationship. This directly pertains to the condition of the polygonal block surfaces that are in contact with simple masonry. Polygonal blocks were not fitted to rough stone masonry. There is never a structural bond between polygonal sections and crude masonry. They are always either butt-jointed or overlapped. Therefore, it is crucial to examine the side surfaces of polygonal blocks facing simple masonry. These surfaces should not bear the distinctive jointing profiles characteristic of polygonal masonry. If such profiles are present, it can only mean one thing. These blocks were once part of a fully polygonal structure. This means that these blocks cannot be considered elements newly crafted by Inca Masons to highlight a significant section of a building. If they retain inactive jointing marks, it indicates that they are merely fragments of a previously complete polygonal structure. In other words, if the Inca truly wanted to emphasize the importance of a section of a building, they did not need to create new blocks. They repurposed a surviving fragment of an earlier polygonal structure. In this case, master polygonal masons would not have been necessary at all. The same logic applies to cases where polygonal masonry is used up to a certain level in a building, and above that, the wall continues with small rough stones set in mortar. For doorways and openings, one might still apply the argument that, quote, the Inca highlighted important sections with polygonal blocks. However, this explanation does not hold for cases where, at an arbitrarily defined level, a section is considered important, but above that point, it is not. Such reasoning is inconsistent. Moreover, if something is meant to be accentuated with finer craftsmanship, it would make more sense for that to be at eye level, rather than at the foundation. A far more significant observation is that simple masonry is always positioned on top of polygonal masonry layers. In other words, polygonal masonry always precedes rough stone construction. Here, too, it would be useful to analyze the side surfaces of polygonal blocks that interface with simple masonry to check for any remaining jointing marks from a former structure. It is obvious that the construction of polygonal buildings or even individual polygonal sections required skilled craftsmen, masters proficient in polygonal masonry technology. At the same time, the question of these masters is closely linked to the origins and development of polygonal masonry technology itself. For example, over what period did it develop? Where was it refined, and on what structures? There is no consensus among official theories. Many believe that the Inca independently developed polygonal masonry, inventing and refining all its key aspects. Yet there are just as many proponents of the idea that this technology was introduced from an external source. The Inca certainly had masters in various fields: metallurgy, pottery, weaving, and construction. These professionals were called kamiak, and they held hereditary status. However, within the territory controlled by the Inca, we do not see anything that could have led to the emergence of polygonal masonry specialists. There is no visible evolution of polygonal technology. We only see its fully developed results, complete with all of its distinctive features and details. There are no traces that could be interpreted as different stages of its development. At times, certain masonry characteristics or levels of block preparation might seem like signs of evolution. But upon closer examination, it always turns out that a given structure or its part was designed for specific operating conditions or had a specialized function. In other words, these are specialized structural adaptations within the same technology. And specialization of technological elements is usually an indicator of a prolonged period of evolution or even an advanced level of technological development. The polygonal structures we know possess all the necessary details and characteristics. They have distinctive architectural and structural features, the presence of which implies a history of evolution. Yet, no predecessors are known. It is as if they appeared out of nowhere. As if polygonal technology was developed elsewhere and then transferred here in its fully formed state, along with all the knowledge, skills, and tools. Furthermore, polygonal technology not only appears seemingly out of nowhere and in its entirety, it also disappears just as abruptly, vanishing completely in historical terms, leaving behind only its original constructions. This sudden disappearance is further emphasized by the fact that many polygonal structures were clearly never completed. The different types of polygonal masonry also appear to be fully developed, and their variety is a highly significant factor. There are major differences between them. These differences primarily concern block preparation for laying, which is reflected in the final appearance of the masonry itself. It seems natural and necessary that each of these types, before leaving its mark in the form of the polygonal structures we know today, must have gone through its own process of development. A period of refinement for all necessary techniques. And this process could not have been brief. Ancient architectural styles were typically very static. Yet there are no traces of their gradual refinement. They appear fully developed, with all their distinctive details. A shift to a new construction method always involves certain risks. It must be driven by serious reasons. It must be justified. And it must be properly supported, as it requires an appropriate material base. It also requires individuals who are capable and willing to implement it. One possible explanation is that in regions neighboring the Inca, there may have been craftsmen who, for some reason, acquired the necessary knowledge, skills, and practical experience in polygonal construction. When needed, they were invited to build. Meanwhile, local workers could continue making adobe bricks and stacking walls of small, unworked stones. This is a kind of compromise theory. In this case, the Inca are seen as capable organizers. The Mida laborers and Kamayak masters continue building as they always have. And the externally recruited polygonal masons construct key buildings or significant parts of them. To some extent, this theory is reflected in Spanish chronicles. There are records that the Inca employed skilled stonemasons from neighboring regions, including Tiwanaku. It is said that before conquering Tiwanaku, the Inca were unfamiliar with polygonal masonry. Supposedly, Pachacuti, the ninth ruler of the Inca Empire, was so impressed by the structures in Tiwanaku that he ordered his people to build in the same way. As a result, Inca stonemasons supposedly mastered the technique to such an extent that they became unparalleled craftsmen. However, even this theory has inconsistencies. By the time the Inca extended their influence to Tiwanaku, no significant construction had been carried out there for several centuries. So who could they have hired? Or from whom could they have learned? But the main issue lies elsewhere. Polygonal masonry technology cannot be derived from Tiwanaku's stoneworking and construction methods. Tiwanaku's construction techniques have nothing in common with polygonal masonry. They differ in every aspect. These are completely opposing approaches to all key aspects of stone construction. Even with a superficial visual comparison, one can easily determine which technology was used to create a particular structure. And this is crucial, because it is impossible for the Inca to have studied one technology yet mastered something entirely different. These differences deserve a more detailed look. Blocks in Tiwanaku are always parallelepipeds. Their faces are flat and set strictly at right angles. Such blocks are interchangeable, and they could be mass-produced away from the construction site. The walls are fairly smooth. Masonry with such blocks does not require great effort. It consists simply of placing the blocks in sequence. The wall is formed by filling the space between vertically positioned framing blocks. In polygonal masonry, each of these points is the complete opposite. The blocks are not interchangeable. Each has a unique shape. Each block in the masonry has a designated spot meant only for it. Their forms are far from regular. Even in the case of brick-like polygonal masonry, the sides of the blocks tend to have more or less pronounced curved profiles. In polygonal masonry, joint profiles vary widely. Even when using brick-like blocks, the horizontal course lines are never perfectly straight. They always have some degree of waviness. The wall is constructed in a strictly sequential manner, with blocks laid in a specific order. These differences are more than evident. They concern the fundamental principles of both construction technologies, making it impossible to speak of any continuity between them. Likewise, it is impossible to argue that polygonal masonry developed from Tiwanaku-style construction. The root of this difference likely lies in the underlying philosophy of construction itself. As Protzen put it, Tiwanaku masons treated their stones as good building material, but nothing more. With polygonal masonry, however, something greater is evident, a principle that has been discussed many times before. Polygonal structures reflect an effort to integrate as seamlessly as possible into the natural environment, to merge with it. There are also chronicles stating that the Inca used prisoners for construction work. For ordinary buildings, this makes sense, as free labor for unskilled tasks. But for polygonal structures, this seems unlikely, as the question again comes down to knowledge and skills. No evidence exists of polygonal construction being practiced in regions adjacent to Inca-controlled lands. And if it was not practiced there, it is impossible that polygonal masons could have come from those regions. Thus, once again, we are left without a definitive answer. Another possibility is that polygonal structures were built before the Inca took control of this region, constructed by their predecessors. Certain aspects can indeed be seen as confirmation of this. For example, many structures have walls made of polygonal blocks only up to a certain level. With simple masonry continuing above, all signs suggest that these upper sections were added later, and their authorship is easy to determine. In such hybrid structures, the differences in materials and construction techniques are strikingly evident. The sections built from small, almost unworked stones appear to be attempts to compensate for damaged areas of polygonal masonry or to add necessary structural details. There are also more specific observations, previously mentioned. These additions never integrate with the polygonal sections. They are always placed on top or adjacent without interlocking bonds. This makes it abundantly clear that all elements made from unworked stone were added later and are not structurally connected to the polygonal masonry. In Inca structures, individual polygonal blocks are often found, clearly out of place. Or small sections of interlocking polygonal blocks appear within larger constructions. Their surface quality, finishing style, and shape stand in stark contrast to the surrounding materials. It is obvious that they were once part of a more fitting masonry structure and are now being reused. Such reuse has a practical aspect, as polygonal blocks or preserved fragments of their masonry are always of high quality. They guarantee strength and durability. But there is another dimension to this practice. A well-crafted block is undeniably valuable as a building material. Yet at the same time, it may serve as a marker of the builder's aesthetic or religious preferences. All of this suggests that before the Inca began their intensive building efforts, stone structures already existed in this territory, in varying states of preservation. And these were polygonal structures. The Inca did not need to travel far to see examples of this technology. However, their mere presence would not have been enough to reveal the techniques or tools required to achieve such results in stonework. To their credit, the Inca made effective use of this inheritance. With characteristic diligence and perseverance, they repaired and extended neglected polygonal structures to suit their own needs. At the same time, they imitated certain features that particularly appealed to them. Yet, their constructions exhibit entirely different structural characteristics compared to completed polygonal structures. Polygonal structures have inward slanting walls. Inca buildings do not follow this rule. Polygonal structures rarely share walls. Inca buildings are often interconnected. There are no partition walls in polygonal structures. In Inca buildings, partitions are common. Trapezoidal niches in polygonal structures are always aligned at the top edge, even if this required modifying the upper block to accommodate the alignment. Inca structures have no such rule. Window openings are rare in polygonal structures. Inca buildings feature windows, sometimes excessively. Polygonal structures are predominantly single-story. Inca buildings were often built with 2 levels. Niches in polygonal buildings generally face inward. Niches in Inca buildings frequently open outward. And finally, polygonal structures did not have roofs. Inca buildings did. For this purpose, they built gables with embedded blocks, featuring cylindrical or square protrusions for securing roof supports. In polygonal structures, similar elements face inward and are positioned between the niches, slightly above them. These features are even present in cases where a roof would have been unnecessary, such as in the grotto at Machu Picchu. This suggests that in polygonal structures, blocks with such protrusions formed a functional set with the niches, rather than serving as roof supports, which would have been irrelevant in such locations. There are also notable differences when comparing Inca agricultural terraces to polygonal terraced structures. Many polygonal terraces have horizontal surfaces that are too small for effective agriculture. Moreover, they are often difficult to access. Building a polygonal face structure on a steep slope just to create an impractical planting area seems highly irrational. Some of them are constructed on slopes steeper than 60 degrees. Moreover, they were often made extremely narrow, clearly not designed for farming. And their fill material reflects this. Fertile topsoil was not required. Lighting is another issue. Some of these terraces would receive insufficient sunlight for growing crops. And when such structures are located on high peaks, temperature regulation would be an additional challenge. Another important point is that if these terraces were intended for agriculture, the expected return would have been wildly disproportionate to the effort required to build them. The defensive theory does not hold up either, as discussed in a separate analysis. Nor does the idea that they were built simply to reinforce slopes, since in many cases, they do not so much hold the slope as cling to it, adding weight instead of stabilizing it. The Inca borrowed much here as well, even incorporating steps into their terraces, copying the protruding stones found in polygonal terrace structures. But they did so crudely, in line with their construction capabilities. Without understanding the purpose of these features or the logic behind their design. This is particularly evident in the way they often ignored the inward slant of polygonal walls, and frequently failed to maintain consistent niche alignment. Clearly, the principles that governed polygonal structures were unknown to the Inca. And when reproducing external features became difficult, they simply abandoned them. This point is quite revealing. It clearly illustrates that the Inca were interested only in the superficial resemblance to certain features characteristic of polygonal structures. They neither needed nor sought the results provided by polygonal technology, and they likely had no awareness of any deeper purpose behind it. Their needs, including aesthetic preferences, were fully satisfied with rubble masonry set in mortar. With rough approximations of distinctive elements like trapezoidal openings and niches, coral, or long protruding stones in terrace walls. This is a telling detail. It demonstrates that blindly copying the external appearance of polygonal structures, especially using non-authentic materials and techniques, does not lead to an understanding of the principles that shaped their design. It generally produced results acceptable to the Inca, but it could not replicate the functional aspects of the original structures. Such imitation had its natural limits, defined by human needs. The roofs on Inca buildings are the best illustration of this. Polygonal structures, due to their design, were not suited for human habitation. They lacked details that could provide even minimal comfort, and in the mountains, it would have been difficult to endure without a roof. Thus, the Inca modified and expanded these structures as needed, adapting them to their basic physiological requirements. And even today, the same approach continues. Chronicles state that before the Inca, polygonal technology was unknown, but all indications suggest that it was unfamiliar to the Inca as well. Its details remained undiscovered even after their time. Everything points to the fact that the Inca reused individual polygonal blocks, extensively incorporated surviving polygonal structures, modifying them to fit their own needs. They also attempted to replicate certain external features, but using different materials and entirely different, more accessible construction methods. This defines the parameters that frame the phenomenon of polygonal construction. First, there is the territorial localization of polygonal technology. Its distribution is overwhelmingly tied to mountainous regions and foothills, and it is relatively compact. Furthermore, it does not align with the boundaries of Inca-controlled territory. Most of the Inca Empire contains no polygonal structures or complexes, despite their long-standing dominance in many areas. Instead, those regions are filled with buildings made from unworked stone set in mortar, or structures of small stones later covered in plaster. Second, there is the temporal localization of polygonal technology. Its three main stages, appearance, existence, and disappearance, all exhibit an equally abrupt and intense nature. The exact time of its emergence is unknown. Its genesis is untraceable, as is the development of its various masonry types. All known polygonal structures exhibit either a fully realized set of technological characteristics or a specialized combination of them. In other words, ready-made, fully developed solutions were used to construct polygonal buildings, but where they were developed, there is no data. All attempts to derive this technology through the refinement or modification of stoneworking techniques in Tiwanaku, Chavín de Huantar, Churosechin in the Casma Valley, or Pucara lack solid justification. These techniques share some similarities, but this likely stems not from direct lineage between them, but from the independent application of the most basic and accessible principles of working with stone. Nothing would have prevented each of these cultures from rediscovering these principles on their own, in the right conditions. At the same time, polygonal masonry represents a completely different and much higher level of interaction with various types of stone, a more complex and developed method in every respect. It should have been preceded by a significant period of acquiring the necessary knowledge and refining the approach. A period of trial and error. A period of testing structures for durability and stability, identifying shortcomings and implementing necessary improvements. Yet no material evidence of these processes exists. Polygonal technology disappeared just as abruptly as it appeared, leaving behind structures filled with unique architectural features and distinctive external characteristics that are found nowhere else. It vanished without passing down the necessary knowledge, and without leaving any craftsman capable of continuing the tradition. It is also clear that its final stage lacked logical continuity. The process was interrupted. Many structures and complexes remained unfinished. Thus, we arrive at a rather unambiguous picture. In the period preceding the rise and dominance of the Inca, a construction technology suddenly emerged and spread across a limited territory adjacent to the Andes, a technology focused on the complete integration of artificial structures into their natural environment. An integration so effective that it allowed them to exist autonomously for extended periods. It appeared fully formed, with all its necessary technological elements, many of which required specialized knowledge and skills in working with stone, as well as the appropriate material resources. Its mode of expansion was also unusual. In many well-preserved complexes, certain sections appear to have been built as if by a single hand. Given the sheer volume of work involved, this could suggest strict construction traditions, standardized methods, and tools. If the construction took place over an extended period. Alternatively, if the time frame was short, it suggests an effort to cover as much territory as possible within a limited span of time. But its most peculiar trait is that the structures built with this technology often did not even meet basic human needs. Taken together, all these factors indicate that polygonal technology was a brief and localized phenomenon, resulting in structures embedded into our world, with functions that lie outside our sphere of everyday use.